NSFW prison guards of Reddit. What's the most disturbing thing you've dealt with? Psych patient, after placed in an observation cell, pulls a razor out of his anus and proceeds to go to town on his genitals. Inmate in segregation, would regularly eat his own shoot. Multiple bad fights and suicide attempts. Contractor fell 30 feet. Ankle was completely 90 degrees to his leg. Refused an ambulance or medical assistance for fear of being drug tested. Assuming. Had 2 guys working with him help him walk the half mile to the front gate. Worst by far was a seg inmate slipping his cuffs, removing an officer's bean slot bar, big chunk of iron with a prong on the end we used to open slots in the cell doors to pass trays through / handcuff inmates and beat him to death with it. Was one of the first responders. I quit shortly after this one. Edit. Never worked there, but an inmate at the local county jail 2 weeks ago beat 2 female guards, killing one and leaving the other with brain damage. One of them worked for my mom for years. The world sucks. Former prison guard. I had to escort a new prisoner to medical. I had no idea why until we got to medical. He had bandages all over both legs and he walked stiff-legged cold and bent his legs. When he sat down, the nurse started removing bandages to expose rotted, abscessed flesh. He was a heroin addict and was injecting in his legs. His legs were so swollen and gangrenous that the smell almost put me down. When he tried to bend his right leg, the skin split and infection oozed all over the floor. The doctor looked at me and immediately called for another guard to come to the room. I asked what was wrong and she said, "You're going into shock. I need you to leave before you pass out." Surprised at what she said, I protested, but she demanded that I leave. On my way out, I started to feel lightheaded. I looked in a mirror and noticed that I was sheet white, normally a brown guy. I've seen people hanging. I've seen people stabbed and shot. I saw a guy blow his head off with a shotgun. When I was in the Corps, I've pulled burned bodies out of a crash CH-53E. This, by far, was the worst thing I've ever seen. I knew a prison guard at Winson Green in Birmingham, and he said the most disturbing thing about Fred West was how jovial he was. The officers kept forgetting and laughing at his jokes and stuff and then thinking, this guy sexually tortured his own daughter and buried her in concrete. A buddy of mine is a guard at a women's prison. He wants us to confiscate a Jolly Rancher dildo. These crafty women collected Jolly Ranchers and molded a rainbow colored shaft, then wrapped it in saran wrap from the kitchen and passed it around. My friend's mom was a prison guard when I was younger. We went there our whole class and she told us about how inmates would break down mentally. One story I remember her telling multiple times. She was on night shift and was suddenly alerted by screams of help. The screams came from a cell, and her being careful she looked inside the door window. There, in the farthest corner, an inmate was on a chair, screaming, pleading for help, and trying to avoid something on the ground. Mom, what's wrong, inmate? Inmate, it's the chickens. Please get them out, while still standing on the chair, jumping and crying. Mom, what chickens? Where are they? Inmate, everywhere. Please get them out. So friend's mom opened the cell door and guided the invisible chickens out. The inmate calmed down, but as friend's mom closed the cell door, he screamed, "You forgot one." So she went back in and got the remaining chick. Note, the inmate in this story was a big-ass biker dude. He was probably on drugs, but I think it's a fun story. My dad never told me about this, let alone about him working at the prison. Mom told me about the reason why he quit. However, Dad was getting everyone back to their cells, and when passing by one of the cells that had already been checked and filled, his face was splashed by a boiling liquid. He had to be rushed to the hospital for his burns. Turns out the prison gave each cell a hot plate of some sort, and a prisoner had boiled his pee and threw it at my dad's face. After that he got out of being a prison guard and began doing blue-collar work. I worked in juvenile corrections. One of my kids threw a tantrum before lights out. After lots of questioning, we eventually learned that it was because one of the other kids was threatening to grape him. From when my dad was a guard, 2 prisoners trying to kill a 3rd prisoner. The shank broke, so they put a pen in his ear and stomped on it. It came out his mouth and he lived. My dad used to work as a co, and he would never tell me any stories about his time there until one day of constant badgering he told me the tale of the Easter surprise. Easter morning, one of the inmates thought it would be a brilliant idea to get completely naked and shove a toilet scrubber all the way up his ass, so the only part visible was his bristled bunny tail. He then proceeded to scream that he was the Easter bunny while trying to hop around and avoid the oncoming guards. Edit. Thanks for the gold, kind stranger. I work closely with all the prisons in the state. There's one notorious inmate who likes to jerk off and throw hyssum in everyone's face. Fellow inmates, guards, it doesn't matter. He's not strict to see men. Sometimes piss and shoot, just whatever he can get his hands on. My dad was installing a ventilation system at a women's prison. He had a nice chat and a sandwich with an inmate. After they said goodbye to each other, a guard told my dad that the woman was sentenced for life because she killed her husband and put the body through a meat grinder. Edit. I'm adding a bit of extra info for people asking for more details. This happened in 70s, and my dad was working under very lenient regulations. My dad and his co-workers were merely told not to interact with the inmates, but there were no significant consequences for them if said interactions happened. I had a neighbor who was a co at a juvenile prison in my city. There was a new kid at the prison one day. He was apparently very shy and very quiet. He had the misfortune of sharing a cell with one of the more violent inmates. His second night there, his cellmate unscrewed a screw from a bench and sat on his bed in the middle of the night. When he woke up, he said, "I'ma make you a pirate," and shoved the screw into the new kid's eye. My neighbor was the first co to respond to the kid's calls for help. When asked why he shoved a screw in the new kid's eye, he claimed that he looked at him the wrong way. That's a pretty fricked up situation, if you ask me, and not one I'd like to deal with under any circumstances. Not a correctional officer, but I did work as a PA for 8 months in a state prison. I saw an inmate shove 2 to 3 feet of an electrical cord up his urethra in an attempt to cath himself. I saw an inmate rip out a catheter, and he was bleeding profusely from the urethra. His cell looked like a pig was butchered and eaten it. I saw one down in the comments I saw frequently but forgot. Inmates would often make homemade dermal implants in their penis. They would cut the skin, slip something in the wound like an eraser or piece of metal I guess, and try to get it to heal without getting infected. This was to give more pleasure to the ladies when they were out. Of course many were in there for decades or longer. Not really disturbing in a traditional sense, but still made me uncomfortable. Imiko at the Denver complex for the Department of Corrections. Seeing James Holmes, the Aurora theater shooter, come through our processing after getting sentenced. I'd seen this man's face and heard the stories for 2 years on TV, but seeing him in person just slapped me in the face with a weird sense of reality. I don't really know what I expected, but it was pretty disturbing to me personally. If that doesn't count, then seeing an offender hanging from a sheet in their cell. My dad is retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons and started out in the California prison system. There are a lot of stories that us kids didn't find out until he was retired. He was attacked with a pipe and almost died. He doesn't know who attacked him or why. He was on a kill list from the Mexican mafia, and my mom got threatening phone calls from people saying they were watching us kids at the bus stop. He transported inmates back to Cuba, where they were promptly walked around a corner and shot and killed after they were handed over. I'm pretty sure he shot and killed fleeing inmates, but he won't confirm it. He has walked in on many suicides and saved a few people trying to commit suicide. He won't talk about a lot of things, like riots. He was head of the SWAT team, so he has seen some shoot. I've tried to get him to write these stories down, but he won't do it because he doesn't want anyone to get in trouble. Edit. About the SWAT team, I never saw it written down, so it could have been SRT instead. I know there were 2 special response teams, and he was the head of one of them. Most of these stories came from my mom, as he doesn't like to talk about things has SE. One of the few things he ever told me was that Manornariga was an asshole. Worked for a state prison in Louisiana for 5 years. A few highlights. Inmate ripped his own colostomy bag out in the shower, which resulted in his death. Inmate attempted suicide by cutting his own jugular vein. Lived because of the officer's training. Inmate attempted to cut his own penis off because he no longer wanted to be a male. changed his mind halfway through after pain became too much. Inmate heated coffee and baby oil in cup for several minutes, then threw in dorm officer's face. I will never forget the screams of the officer, who unfortunately lost his eye. Inmate was raped so much he could not longer control his bowel movements. Not me but my cousin. One day she found a guy cutting his deck open and sticking tiny plastic balls inside the wounds, and the inmate wanted it to heal like that so when he gets out it would pleasure the ladies. Edit, not fixing my small typo. Inmates in a level 5 yard bunk up to a cell. One inmate decided to pledge himself to his cellie for life by allowing him to cut his testicles out with a repurposed safety razor blade. Much blood, 0//10 would not recommend. Not me but a friend of mine is a correctional officer at a jail, and I asked him this question after 6 months of him working there. He said there was an older sane man that barely spoke any English youth that bashed his head on the wall until he started bleeding and demanded to be airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta. His injury wasn't that bad, so they were able to treat him in the jail and tossed him in the padded room so he could not hurt himself anymore. I guess he wasn't satisfied, so he took out his drenchers and scraped at the wound he got from hitting his head on the wall until there was a 3-inch area of skull exposed. Needless to say he got what he wanted and was airlifted out of there. I have two. One co-friend at a city lockup knew an inmate who everyone called the gingerbread man. He would get naked and cover himself head to toe in poop. He was trying to get insanity, but his crimes were drug dealing related. He was beaten rather badly a number of times by the 3 or 5 guys he shared a cell with. He stopped eventually, then went to real prison. Another co I know knew a guy who was kept solo because he kept trying to give people his HIV. Filling plastic pen tubes with blood, he would try to stab people and then blow into the tube. He died one night when my co-friend wasn't there, when he broke a light in the infirmary and started slashing himself up and threatening to give anyone who came in HIV. They locked the door and told him to wash up under the shower. He wouldn't, and he bled out hours later. Some co's get reprimands and demerits or whatever, but nobody lost a job because the investigator could understand not wanting to be given HIV from a bleeding psycho armed with long shards of broken glass. Edit, I just asked, and the guy with HIV didn't die. He passed out from blood loss and was revived. In a CO at a maximum prison. I've seen an inmate lick his own chute off his walls. I've seen an inmate cut up where his cell floor was covered in blood. They will dilute it in water to make it look like there is more blood than there is. The inmate lived, and I've seen an inmate hog tie his cellie and put a plastic bag on his head and then put his property box on top of his head. Inmate survived. Guys I've worked with have seen worse, like an inmate ripping open his guts, an inmate pulling chicken bones out of his urethra, and of course inmates who have successfully hung themselves or got beat to death by their cellie. Not a prison officer, but my dad spent 26 years working as one in the UK. Brixton then Belmarsh. Heard a lot of crazy stories including how the IRA prisoners used to be. Mess strikes used to happen frequently. They used to cover themselves in their own feces, wait for the guards to go into the cell and attack them. They then just started hosing them down through the service flap. He also told me swallowing razor blades was fairly common amongst prisoners. Although one time this guy didn't think that would be enough, so he slotted a bunch of razor blades amongst the bristles of a toilet brush and then rammed the whole thing down his throat up to the handle. He lived. An inmate in segregation got very upset that he didn't get some paper a co promised to get him on first shift. Friker ripped off his own big toenail and cut up his arm with it. Went on a field trip to a correctional facility, and one of the guards told us about how there was this one prisoner who would constantly cover himself in his own feces. He didn't stop there as he would hang himself still covered in chute. When inmates hang themselves, guards obviously have to try to save them. The way they do it is one guard lifts up the inmate to relieve the pressure as the other one cuts the rope. So the guard who held him up would be covered in chute. Yay, he did this often as well. My stepsister watches over criminals with severe mental disabilities in a home that is on lockdown. These people are dangerous and many don't know the difference between right and wrong. One night she heard commotion in one of the rooms and walked in on a 14-year-old boy being raped by a 20 or so year old man. Don't know all the deets, but that's all I need to know. Thank God there's people out there who can do these jobs, because I definitely could not. When I used to work in the jail, I initially thought people covering themselves and their cells in feces was as bad as it ever got. Then one of the inmates in my partner's cell block had a miscarriage into the toilet and smeared the afterbirth all over the cell door. Suddenly, a Picasso doesn't seem all that bad. I don't work corrections, but I still respond to local jails to complete assessments for inmates on suicide watch. Arrived just in time for sheriffs to locate a dead inmate with one eyeball popped out of his head. After watching security footage, they discovered another inmate was choking him while they were freaking and the guy killed him on accident. F-ked his eyeball out.